Okay, so please, big welcome to Jenny Phillips. Yeah!
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? So I'm just going to give sort of a layout of what we're going to be doing over the next, I guess it's an hour. In some ways, I feel as if these guys, the Dhamma brothers, have been my inspiration for learning so much about the world that I didn't know before. They're my teachers. And in fact, when I thought about making this film, I thought, well, I'm going to make a film about prisoners, and they're going to become teachers for the world. And then I thought, no, that could never happen. And yet I find they've worked their ways into people's hearts over the years. The movie is translated into 28 languages. We're just about to produce a new DVD. It's just got the film, but it's got subtitled 28 languages. It's gone around the world. It's hard to imagine. It's a very small story, but I believe that small stories can change the world. And so these are very small stories of people that are unseen, unheard, untouchables, and yet here they are, sharing their wisdom with the world. So I've learned so much. So I just want to open with two questions, which are rhetorical questions, which I ask myself all the time. How do we make peace in a violent world? And how do we care for one another? And I recently saw, I think it was on Facebook, maybe you all saw, Thich Nhat Hanh's comment about climate change. And he said, the only solution to climate change is love. And I was thinking, oh, that's weird. Why would you say that? We got a lot of things to do. We got to roll up our sleeves here. But, you know, he's right when I really thought about it. I mean, that's where it all has to begin. And I wanted to give a quote from Ramakrishna, who was a 19th century mystic poet. And he said, when we care for others, we're helping ourselves. And we're filled with gratitude because they're giving us the opportunity to help them, and that helps ourselves. And I'm not sure that's exactly a Western concept, because I think in the world of the ego, we think, well, that's egotistical. Why would we help people to help ourselves? But I've had the great good fortune to be reading the Pali Canon over the last year in an intensive study and practice program. And these are the writings that came out, some of them very soon, within months after the Buddha's death, which was 2,600 years ago. And then they kind of trailed along for the next century or two with different writings. But it was the time of oral tradition. It was actually even before, I think there was writing in the world, but people weren't, in general, weren't writing these things down. And this was in the forests of Northeast India, and there was no written tradition there yet. And they spoke a language called Pali, P-A-L-I, which was coincident with Sanskrit, but it was more the vernacular in the forests of Northeast India. It's all about cultivating the heart. It's just amazing. I mean, it's so relevant today. It's always relevant. Maybe you know some of these Pali words, dana, which means giving in a complete sense, not just giving somebody a present on their birthday, but really giving. Metta, which is loving kindness, and I think a lot of us are talking about that today. That word is, those words of loving kindness are very familiar. It's really not a good translation, loving kindness, because it has nothing to do with love in the way we understand it. It literally means in Pali, bursting with friendliness. That's the literal translation. And then there's karuna, which is compassion, which is really different. And again, it's about cultivating these qualities of the heart, because the mind left unattended is going to revert to some of the common, Koto was saying yesterday, the three poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion. According to the Pali Canon, those are the three poisons of the mind, and we all get stuck in them very easily. We have to cultivate these. It's not something that's lying, it might be dormant, but it's not natural for us to have these qualities ready to hand without working on their cultivation. So to illustrate, I just wanted to say, let's suppose you're walking down the street and you see a homeless person, and they might be lying all over the place, and they might be drunk, and they might be dirty, and all those things. And what do you do? And do you bend down and put money in their cup and then hurry away and feel sorry for them? And that's not compassion, that's sympathy, which is fine, but it's not the depth of the quality of compassion. Or do you really meet that person's eye and have a moment with them in which it's not that they're out there and you're in here, in the world of Buddhism, which is all about non-self, which took me a long time to begin to figure out what that means, but it's not about the ego. And it's really feeling their emotions as if they were your own. Quite different, right, than sympathy, which is you're out there and you've got a miserable life and I'm so sorry for you. Compassion is quite different. And we know that neuroscience has been showing us now for about 20 years through these functional MRI studies and many research projects that this actually, cultivating these qualities that the Buddha was talking about 2,600 years ago, changes your brain. And if you continue to cultivate them, it permanently changes your brain, the structure and function of your brain, and areas of your brain that you're not normally even using open up and begin to, and then areas of negativity will, become weakened. I wanted to just talk for a minute about a new film that I've been working on. We've been filming for 3 years. We're now into the early stages of editing the film, and it's tentatively called Beyond the Wall. Very similar to the Dhamma brothers. I hope it has the power of that film. We'll see. But we're following people as they come out of prison and telling their stories, and remarkable stories of compassion among prisoners, among themselves. Quite unexpected what we're finding. And I'll just mention the story of Billy the barber, who's one of the central characters in the film. And Billy had a terrible childhood of abandonment and abuse, and as a very young child was sent to live with a very old, feeble grandmother, abandoned by both of his parents in New York City. So he kind of woke up in this strange place with this woman who he was very able to trick and fool in a housing project in Lawrence. And if you know anything about Lawrence, it's kind of a haven of drugs and violence right now in the state of Massachusetts. And so Billy began a lifetime, many years of real violent crime and drug addiction. And finally, he got, blessedly, he will say today, he ended up being incarcerated. And when he worked his way out, he worked with a guy named Louis, who's really the central character in the film. And Louis is a former prisoner himself. And Billy's dream was to become a barber. And Louis was counseling him and helping him right from the time he ended up in detox and then in a halfway house. Louis was helping him his dream of becoming a barber. And so lo and behold, he worked in a barber shop. He got up in the middle of the night for, a year and took the train to Boston where he attended barber classes. And he was almost finished. The last thing that was standing in his way was to become a master barber. He had to get a master barber license. And so he took his son, because he needed a model. He needed to cut somebody's hair in front of judges in this suburb outside of Boston. It was a cold January day, freezing cold. And he took his son and he went to the place. And his son sat down in the chair and took off his hat, and he had practically no hair. I don't know why Billy didn't figure that out before, but they said, "Sorry, Billy, you can't take your class today because you can't take your test because we need to see you cut hair." So Billy went out into the streets, and he was walking down to get a cup of coffee in the subway station, and he saw a homeless man just dead drunk and stretched out in the cold and in the dirt and smelling. You could smell him outside. And so he leaned over this guy and he said, "I'll give you $10 if you'll let me give you a haircut," because he could see the guy's hair hanging down out of his hat. So the guy said, "Okay." And so he led him back to the testing center and took off the guy's hat, and all the judges, their mouths had dropped open. They couldn't believe that this person was coming into their sanitary place. And then they said, "Well, you have to take your coat off." So he took off a coat, and then he took off a coat, and then he took off a coat. He had 5 coats on. He actually wasn't a very big man at all when you got all the coats off. And Billy cleaned him up, shaved him, cut his hair. He said he looked like Tom Cruise when he finished. And then he put his arms around him and he gave him a big hug, and the guy left. And the master barbers, the judges were saying, you know, how could you do that? How could you put your arms around that man? He was so horrible. And the words that Billy said have just stuck with me. He said, I recognized his smell. That was my smell. So that to me is really compassion. This guy wasn't out there somewhere. He and Billy were one. There was no separation between the two of them. So, and I believe, and I think a lot of people have been talking about this today, or so far since we've been here, about suffering, because I really believe that suffering is the grist for the mill of healing and recovery. And if we walk around on our cell phones, everybody's walking down the street on their cell phones. They're not even noticing where they're going or who they're with. But people who are suffering, and that's why prison, for me, I woke up in prison one day. I have had a life of great fortune. I did a lot of adventures when I was very young. I was a nurse back then. Well, I'm still a nurse, but I was practicing nursing. And I went and worked with Eskimos, and I worked in Southern Africa in the Peace Corps in a little country called Lesotho, which was a mountainous enclave inside the Republic of South Africa. And then I came home and I raised children, and I had a mental health practice. I never stopped practicing as a psychotherapist, but I wasn't really getting, you know, rolling up my sleeves and getting out of my office. And I was frustrated by that, but what are you going to do when you're raising children? I mean, they really have to come first. So finally, when my youngest was going to college, I decided I was going to, I read a story about prison volunteers, and so I made a phone call and I went in and I actually participated in a group in prison, a violence prevention kind of group, where I was just a student of this program with the prisoners themselves. And I just began to wake up there to just the importance of these stories and how powerful they are and how much we need to recognize one another's stories. So there's been no turning back from me since then, and I've continued to work in prisons, teaching a program called Houses of Healing, which is a program actually written for prisoners, and every prisoner gets a book called Houses of Healing, and it's, you know, it's basically a psychotherapy group, but meditation is a component of it. And so this has been a really important environment for me to work in. And why is it so powerful? I try to understand why when I walk into a prison, I have these feelings of, you know, a prison is a mighty fortress, and there are keys that people have at their belts, and there are walls, and there are doors, and there are razor wire fencing, and there's so many barriers. And yet when you actually meet these people, I think not all of them, because a lot of them, you know, they give up and they watch cartoons and they become numbers in beds in prison, because it's very hard not to let that happen to yourself and actually lose your humanity. But those who don't have such an incredible amount of to work with because of their suffering. And I always think of prison as a bridge halfway across the water. Okay, we take these guys out of their terrible lives, like Billy, the barber, and we lock them up. But then we don't offer them anything, and they're standing halfway across the water on this bridge. And if we could just open the other side of the bridge and lead them across, which is what I think a good program will do for prisoners, what an incredible thing it would be. So that's why I made the film, you know, was a way of showing people who these people are, people that you would never, ever see. So I'd love to hear your comments after hearing those men. I just want to read this letter so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. And I do get letters from these guys, and hundreds of them. And I have a book here on sale if anybody's interested, called Letters from the Dhamma Brothers, in which I've chosen some of them. But this is John Johnson, the guy, I hate to describe him this way, but the guy with the birthmark on his face. He writes the most incredible letters. But he used to have a radio. I think it was stolen from him, but he loved to listen to NPR stations. And he lives in a part of the prison where there used to be 100 beds. Now it's 130 beds. It might even be 150 beds at this point, where the beds are all shoved together in one big room. But the reason people choose this part of the prison is because you can walk out the door, and there's a prison yard out there. And in fact, he wrote a letter to me about a rabbit that was in the prison yard, which is just beautiful if you ever have a chance to see it. But this letter is about, so he goes outside and he made a little machine which you can actually see it in the film for a second, in which it's like a little claw on the end of a stick, and he loves to clean up the prison yard, and he's out there a lot. And I think if I had to be in that place, I would probably choose to be in that crowded room just so you could get outside. But he's standing outside in the summertime and listening to the radio and watching the sunset. Dear Jenny, the hot dog days of southern summer are here upon us again. Over the years of doing time in the South, I have dreaded summer. But even that seems to have changed. Is it because in my elder years I am more tolerant? Or is this another sign of freeing the attachments from even environmental discomforts that the Vipassana technique has helped me with? Doing time is never comfortable. There are always feelings of inadequacy that arise and can be very discouraging, even after a 1 hour deep Vipassana meditation. I remember recently walking into the exercise yard to watch a sunset. This was a very aesthetic pleasure moment. I was listening to my radio on National Public Station, my kind of music, subtle sensations flowing all around, feeling free in moments and watching sky flowing too. You know what I mean, being one with nature. Then here came another person who looked up at the sky with me. I said, "Hello, isn't this sunset powerful?" He said, "Yeah," but I sensed he felt distressed. I said the usual icebreaker, "What's up?" He said, "I think I'm going to kill myself." I thought, man, you just blew my communing with the sky. How can you not feel this energy? I did not like the discourse I was facing. Although I did know the history of this person, he had messed his life up years ago, killing another convict. I could not take lightly that he could maybe be serious about taking his own life. I would now listen with a compassionate ear and send metta, or loving kindness, to him. After a few moments of talking, up came another convict. Still an awe-inspiring sunset in the sky. This guy says, "I'm really pissed off at so-and-so, and I'm tired of his shit, and I think I'm going to stab his ass and let him know who I am." I think, why is this happening to me? I just want to be happy and watch the sunset. But I too know the history of this guy. He's been in prison for over 20 years, and he's committed murder too. I must share metta with him and listen with a compassionate ear with him also. And after a few moments, the guy who wanted to kill himself said to the other guy, "I can't believe that after all the time you have done, you would let someone get you going like that. Just let it go." How about that? Now, the person who wanted to end his own life is helping save the life of 2 other people. An unexpected twist. Very powerful experience, Jenny. Dhamma phenomena that I never would have dreamed I would have experienced going to watch the sunset on Donaldson's prison yard. Now, with a few months of time passed, these guys are reacting to a better outlook of doing time. Did my metta make any difference? Who knows? I do know that the metta helped me through that experience of all of us suffering and seeing misery. Years ago, I would not have had this metta experience as a tool in facing the reality of doing time. But I would say that any work that you can do inside the walls of a prison, I do. I've worked with prisoners for many years as a volunteer. There's the program I talked about that I teach called Houses of Healing. It's out of the Lionheart Foundation. So if that is something you'd want to do, you don't have to be a clinically trained mental health person to do it. But, you know, they just see the 4 walls, they see the staff, they see one another. As you can see from John's letter, well, John's a very perceptive guy, clearly, but he knows these guys. This is his community, you know, and you got to be careful around some of these guys, but he knows how to work them pretty well. But they need outside voices. They need people to come in and, you know, teach them to paint, teach them a literature course. I've done that. Just take your presence in there and work with them. I think that's the best thing you can do. You could also give toward the Vipassana organization. You could give to my foundation if you wanted to. It's called Freedom Behind Bars. And it just supports the current film I'm making. and the outreach and distribution of the Dhamma brothers. Yeah. Did anybody hear the comment about the baseball coach? What did you think of that? I mean, why that came up, I mean, he associated it with Vipassana. That association is amazing. And he was right. You know, you see the ball coming. Do you run forward? Or do you let the awareness of what's happening in that moment and all the different contributing circumstances around it? Am I going to need to run to the left? Am I going to need to run to the right? Am I going to need to go backwards? You know, step back, and whatever that means. I mean, it's all very metaphorical in a lot of ways. But I just couldn't believe it when he said that. And then Ricky at the very end, Ricky Alexander, the sincerity of his words about, you know, he doesn't want to be around anybody that's doing it. He doesn't want to be around anybody who's around, you know, and on and on and on. His wish for goodness in that environment where goodness, it's possible, but it's not easy, and it's not easy to find. And yet you can believe that. I hope he's still, you know, all of them that are still alive, several of them have died, is still on that pathway, and he hasn't gotten too discouraged. We sentenced these guys to so many years, and they're not all murderers. You know, some of them are, I don't think they did that much. You know, they might have been using drugs or selling drugs, and yet, you know, there they are in the house of pain. It's a very sad waste of humanity, and we need them. We need them among us. I think this is a very good time in our history. Ironically, it's because we can't afford to keep these guys incarcerated that we're having to look at it right now. Some of the most conservative states are coming up with all kinds of creative things, like Texas particularly, and Ohio and Virginia, for avoiding incarceration, having alternatives to incarceration. Because once you incarcerate somebody, like it or not, you've changed their lives forever. They're never going to be the same again. Experience does change us all, but you've also they've got a lot of strikes against them, and that's what my new film is about, is, you know, what happens when these guys come back out again? And what I'm so interested in is where we're designing these reentry systems. Well, what are they really? They're not about helping people in a compassionate way. They're about putting a bracelet on their ankle or making them report to parole. And when you report to parole, you're not necessarily going to see somebody with a smile on their face. I was filming a guy last week. He'd just come out of prison a couple weeks before, and he's so fragile, he's so vulnerable and lost. And he goes to meet for the very first time with his parole officer, and he walks in the door, and the parole officer says to him, "You look terrible. Were you up partying all night?" I mean, can you imagine? And what's that supposed to do? And then he takes out his Corey sheet, his report of, you know, of his incarcerations and crimes, and he says, "You have a 13-page Corey report." And then he takes it and he tears it up in front of him and throws it away. I mean, he has copies of it for sure, but I mean, it's just, you know, what do these guys need? What they need is what I hope to show in my film, and they need other guys just like them who are a little bit ahead of them on the ladder towards recovery, and that's happening. That's really happening in these two cities where I'm doing the filming, the cities of Lowell and Lawrence. These guys, former prisoners, are helping one another. And what I'd like to do someday, if this is a really powerful film, and we have a really good outreach and distribution with it, I'd like to set up a committee of advisors, and on that committee, I definitely want to have some of these returning prisoners, because we need to listen to them. Time? Well, thank you, everybody. I look forward to talking to you all some more, finding you over meals and side conversations. Thank you very much.